This unit is going to focus on lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. All of these are macromolecules, and there is one more macromolecule that is included in these called nucleic acids, but we'll talk about these at another time. The main question that we want to understand with this unit is how do chemical elements recombine as they flow through different living systems? You can guarantee this will be an essay question on your test because this is the overarching idea. To reference your book, you're going to want to go to Chapter 2.
The macromolecules we're going to talk about in Chapter 2 are organic compounds. Basically, they all contain carbon. Carbon is a special element in the sense that it bonds with many other elements on the periodic table. You'll also notice the four macromolecules we talk about contain hydrogen and oxygen, a couple other very important elements, and we'll see some additional ones as well in the structure of the four macromolecules. I'm sure you've all heard the word micro before, micro meaning something very small. Well, these macromolecules are large organic compounds, meaning there's many of these carbons and hydrogen and oxygens bonded together. In this screencast, we're going to discuss four types of these macromolecules. Lipids, which are also known as fats. Carbohydrates, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We find those in things like pasta and bread. Proteins, which we find in meats like chicken and steak. And nucleic acids, which you find in all foods, but as previously discussed, we will discuss nucleic acids a little more specifically later on.
Lipids contain two main elements, including carbon and hydrogen. Lipids are going to include your fats and oils. Some examples are cholesterol, olive oil, butter, and phospholipids. You may have heard the term saturated before. Saturated are the lipids that are more likely to clog your arteries, but this does not mean that you want to cut all lipids or fats out of your diet. You actually need fats in order to build your cell membranes and for hormones to send messages throughout your body. So you actually do not want to cut out all fats from your diet.
Here we can see what a lipid looks like at the molecular level. You can see it consists of basically two parts, the head and then the tail, which can usually consist of 2 or 3 strands. This structure is what makes lipids, in other words fats, afraid of water, or hydrophobic in other words. A good example of this is when we try to mix oil and water together, they don't because of the structure of a lipid.
Lipids are very important to our bodies because they store lots of energy, and they store long-term energy rather than the quick energy that you get from carbohydrates. Fats are more difficult to break down than carbohydrates are. The reason is that they are long chains of fatty acids, so there are many bonds in between the elements. These lines here represent the bonds. In order to break down a fat, you have to break many bonds down in order to break that fat into other material. Therefore, it takes longer to break down fat than it does to break down carbohydrates.
As previously discussed, lipids are an important factor in our everyday diet. You've already learned that lipids function in storing long-term energy, but more specifically phospholipids, they also function in an important way as they make up your cell membranes. So it's important to have those fats in your diets. The cell membrane of your cell is actually responsible for allowing material in and out of the cell so that the appropriate chemical reactions can occur.
A major function for lipids is that they do form that cell membrane. So every time you need new cells, you need lipids in order to make new cell membranes. The cell membranes also help to regulate things that come into the cell and out of the cell. So it makes sure that the proper materials are entering and leaving, and it also protects your cell.
Another one of our macromolecules is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There's different forms of carbohydrates. We have our simple sugars, which are called monosaccharides. Some examples of these would be fructose, which you find in things like honey and other fruits, galactose or lactose, which you find in dairy products like milk, and glucose, which is very common, like we see in table sugar. Other types of carbohydrates that exist are disaccharides, which contain two monosaccharides, hence the di meaning two, and polysaccharides as well, poly meaning many, so it's made up of many sugars.
Carbohydrates are also crucial to your diet. A lot of people tend to go on diets that are low in carbs, and that's actually not a very good idea. The reason for that is that carbohydrates are that glucose that is used to release energy in your body. All of your cells need energy. And how do we get that energy? We get that energy through a process of cellular respiration. I'm going to abbreviate here as CR. Cellular respiration is going to break down all of the foods that we eat into the energy for our cells. Complex carbohydrates that we eat are even broken down into glucose. Even fats that we have stored in our body, when we don't get enough of those carbohydrates, those fats get broken down into glucose. It's a little more slow, which is why it takes you a lot longer to lose a pound of fat, because it takes a lot more work, much slower, to break that down. Plants also can make their own glucose. They do this in a process of photosynthesis. I'm going to abbreviate and shorten there. And for us animals, we actually get our carbohydrates or our glucose to make energy out of the foods that we eat. That's how we get carbohydrates. That's how we're able to actually break down our food into the energy. If you know anybody who is diabetics, basically the pancreas is not distributing or providing the proper amount of insulin to regulate how much glucose is in the body. And so they often have to check their blood sugar, make sure it's the proper amount. And if their blood sugar is not correct, they have to inject insulin into their body to regulate their body with the proper amount of glucose. There are different sizes of carbohydrates. The most simple are monosaccharides. Mono stands for one, and saccharide stands for sugar. Therefore, a monosaccharide is a single sugar, a ring of carbon and oxygen atoms. Monosaccharides can bond together. A monosaccharide, two monosaccharides can go together, combined to form a disaccharide. Di actually means two. So you can see right here, fructose is a monosaccharide, glucose is a monosaccharide. They actually bond together to form sucrose, which is a disaccharide. Two monosaccharides bonded together. And many monosaccharides can join together to form a polysaccharide. Poly simply is a prefix that means many. So here you can see a glucose monosaccharide, another, and another, all joined together in order to form starch, which is a much more complex carbohydrate. Starch is actually how plants store their energy. You may see this in potatoes. Potatoes are actually a huge energy storing organ for plants.
If there is an excess of these polysaccharides or complex sugars, animals will store them as glycogen. Oftentimes this glycogen will get stored into our livers. Sometimes these large complex sugars can also get stored as fat as well. These macromolecules are very important to one another. In fact, these large molecules almost work with one another in a sense that some macromolecules need parts from others to create other macromolecules. I know that sounds confusing, but in an example here with glycogen, one of our polysaccharides, one of our carbohydrates, it's made up of a lot of carbon and hydrogen atoms. Okay? These atoms will actually break their bond and when that bond is broken, the carbon and hydrogen that's left over, that's been unbonded now, will be used to make other macromolecules, like helping build a protein. Carbohydrates are important for several different reasons. For one, starch in plants and glycogen in animals can be very quickly broken down into glucose, similar to what we just saw with glycogen being broken down and helping make a protein. Glucose is also easily metabolized to release energy into the body, which is also needed for life. Starch, glycogen, carbohydrates in general contain less energy than lipids, but are easier to metabolize and access.
The last macromolecule we're going to talk about are proteins. Proteins also contain your basic carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which those three elements are contained in all the macromolecules, but with proteins we're also going to have nitrogen in them. Proteins are made up of smaller pieces called amino acids. These amino acids join together to make these big long chains. So I've got amino acid joined to another amino acid, joined to another amino acid. And so this long chain here is going to be your protein. Okay? There are about 20 amino acids that exist in nature. However, our bodies can only create 8 of them. 8 of those 20. And we need all 20 of them in order to make all the different proteins in our bodies. So, how do we get the other ones that our body cannot actually create? Well, we get it out of the food we eat. If you don't eat enough protein and you're not capable of making all of the proteins, you can have a lot of different issues in your body. You may not even realize it, but the acne on your face may be due to you not getting enough protein to make the proper amino acids to function properly in your body. How does your body make the proteins? Well, it's your DNA that has all of the instructions for making those proteins. And so sometimes there's an issue in your DNA, sometimes there's an issue in your diet.
Here we can see the structure of a protein. Notice how it's a long chain of amino acids. It's important to eat enough proteins so that you get enough amino acids in your body to help with the production of proteins. How the protein is shaped is also important. If the proteins don't fit into one another, they are not able to function for the specific thing that they need to do. Proteins have many different jobs in your body. Some proteins help build muscle and bone. Some help fight disease and infection. Some also help with the speeding up of chemical reactions that occur in the body. Again, if the protein isn't structured the right way and they don't fit together, they won't function together.
Proteins are one of the most important parts of your body. They do things such as form muscles, bone, and every single structure, including what you look like, such as your eye color and your hair color. They move materials in and out of cells. They help you with digestion of materials. For example, if you're lactose intolerant, that means that you are unable to make an enzyme, which is a protein, in order to digest milk. They even help with chemical reactions that happen in your body and help you to fight off disease, so they help with those immune responses. A chemical reaction is when we take one or more chemicals and we react them with different chemicals. So in the lab where you're building macromolecules using the model building kits, you're actually showing how different elements come together to form larger molecules. Here's another example for you. Glucose and oxygen can react to form carbon dioxide and water. So the molecules have been rearranged in order to form new compounds. Enzymes actually help these chemical reactions happen more quickly. The diagram below shows how enzymes work. Two pieces may fit together into the enzyme in order to bring molecules together, or they might come together in the enzyme to break them apart. Enzymes are also very specific. As you can see, only certain materials fit into certain enzymes. And so they only help certain reactions occur, but they can help many of these same reactions occur. Another important protein are enzymes. Enzymes are just a specific group of proteins that actually speed up chemical reactions. But there are two things that can affect an enzyme's ability to actually speed up the chemical reaction. Those two things include the pH that the enzyme is exposed to and the temperature that the enzyme is exposed to. Both of these two things can cause the enzyme to lose its structure.